So today we'll have a look at several things related to DevOps culture. First of all, we'll explore the meaning of the term DevOps and the term culture in this context. These two words or terms have quite different meanings for different people, so I'll just go through the meanings that I'll be using throughout this webinar. Because we're talking about what a DevOps culture feels like, I thought it would be useful to look at some common experiences that many people might have had in order to get a sense of what DevOps culture could feel like based on other experiences, non-technical, if you like. We'll have a little look at some team topologies or team structures, because that has influence on the kind of experience or feeling that we might get when working with other teams. And then we'll look at DevOps culture in practice. What actually would you expect to see on the ground, if you like? There'll be some time for some questions at the end. My slides will take about 25 minutes to run through. Quick background about me: I've been building, deploying, and operating software systems since 1998. I'm writing 2 books currently, one on software operability, one on Windows package management. I run the London Continuous Delivery Meetup group, and with 2 of my colleagues, as Dira mentioned, I facilitate experienced DevOps workshops. So, just as an introduction, let's have a look at this word DevOps. It seems, particularly in the last 6 months or so, that almost every tech job advertised has the word DevOps in it. A lot of those jobs seem to be what we used to call sysadmin. So I'm definitely not going to I'm not talking about that kind of DevOps. I'm also not talking about just infrastructure automation. That seems to be a term that we use, a meaning attached to DevOps, which some people use. Again, that's quite a restricted meaning of the word DevOps, which I'm not going to use here. I also don't believe it's developers somehow doing operations, which is one meaning that some people seem to use. It's also not operations people somehow doing development. So which meaning is it? So CAMS, C-A-M-S, is a fairly established way of describing components of DevOps. So culture, automation, measurement, and sharing between software development teams and operations teams. And it ends up being a set of practices for rapid, reliable software delivery. Our culture turns out to be a hugely important part of DevOps. This slide that you can see here is taken from a deck that Gene Kim and other people presented at Velocity in 2012. And the reason why this is valuable for me, and such a good metaphor, if you like, for me for the importance of culture within DevOps, is that the tools are very easy to see and easy to access. They're on the surface, if you like. The processes perhaps just below the surface, we can still sort of see them, but the weight of culture is well below the surface, and actually culture is arguably the most weighty or the most important part of DevOps in many respects. And if we ignore it, then we're kidding ourselves, as we're pretending to ourselves that we've solved a set of problems which actually we probably haven't. So let's think about what culture, let's come up with a definition for culture. So there's a very useful definition here by Ravasi and Schultz from 2006. They did various a wide-ranging academic study into culture in organisations, and they came up with this definition, which I think is quite useful: a set of shared mental assumptions that guide interpretation and action in organisations by defining appropriate behaviour for various situations. So there's some interesting words in here. The shared mental assumptions. So these, the fact that they're assumptions indicates that perhaps these ideas have not been written down. They're possibly not actually written in any kind of company manifesto or wiki or document anywhere. They're just kind of emerged out of the experiences of people who are working in the organisation. And these assumptions end up defining appropriate behaviour. The implication of all this is that culture is a much bigger and stronger driver of behaviour and interaction between teams than many people initially assume. Getting the culture right is a real enabler for DevOps. So let's have a look at some common experiences, non-technical, that might help us to get a feel for what DevOps culture could be like. So to start with, let's think about a sports team. There's two main goals to a field sports team like soccer, football, or rugby, or these kind of sports. One is attack and one's defence. And attacking, you're looking to score goals, score points. In defence, you're obviously trying to prevent the opposition from scoring goals against you. So there's these broadly two different kind of mentalities, if you like, within the team. One is a preventative mentality, which is the defence. So you're preventing stuff from happening. You're looking to ensure certain things are kept stable, are not degrading, if you like. And obviously that sort of starts to map towards an operational mentality. And then there's the attacking mentality, where you're trying to achieve new stuff all the time, scoring goals, getting points, literally within an agile software development terminology. You're looking to, you have a set of points which you want to deliver. So you've got these two different mentalities in the team. Now, if the members of your team are looking in two different directions, the people in defence thinking about defence and stability and preventing things from happening, and those guys who are in the attack mentality thinking only about scoring points, then the team isn't going to be very effective. The reason the team is effective is because it can combine these two mentalities together, and everyone understands that, yes, there's two different mentalities and they're both valuable, but it's the combination of those two and the balance between those two which helps the team to win. If the attack and defence within the team didn't talk to each other, didn't want to share things with each other, didn't want to pass the ball even, then you'd have a pretty poor performing team. So we might end up saying that DevOps culture feels like a sports team that's playing to win. It has multi-part objectives. It's looking to score points and defend at the same time. And so in the DevOps world, that would be, let's say, development teams who are looking to release new features, but then operational teams who are looking to make sure that these systems are stable and operate well. So the success here comes from the joint shared objectives, and if we were to optimize only for sort of new features or points, or only for defense or operational aspects, then it's not going to be as effective. So here's another real-world experience that some people may have had, which is if you're playing in a band or playing music And if you've ever played in a band and there's one guy, perhaps it's the drummer here, who is not quite in time, not quite with everyone else, it doesn't feel like things are going smoothly. And in fact, to turn it on its head, in the experience that I've had certainly, when everything gels together and a band is performing really well, there's a great sense of achievement and flow, if you like. So in a really successful band, there are distinct roles. Obviously, in this case, you've got a drummer, you've got a bass player, you've got a lead guitarist and a singer. The roles are distinct. There's different sets of skills. It's not like all these skills are merged into one. It's the combination of these skills together which allows that team, if you like, to work well. So we could say that DevOps culture feels like a band of musicians which are in time, in tune, and if you want to use the expression, in the groove. They have different specialisms, but one goal, which obviously is to produce great music. And here's a third and final example from the real world, if you like, or from a non-technical world, which is if you have a vehicle, a car, say, and you're looking to, you want to go on plenty of journeys, you want to be able to, get to your destination without the car needing maintenance. Now, if you never addressed maintenance issues, if you purely left them to, you never inspected the car, and you just kept driving and driving and driving, eventually the wheel's going to fall off. It's important that a balance is struck between making progress to the destination, or to destinations on an ongoing basis, and the maintenance that is needed, the operational activities that are needed on the vehicle. Now, the inverse could be that, let's say, the team is so focused on maintenance and operational activities that the vehicle never leaves the drive, never leaves the forecourt. So you're always tinkering with different aspects of the workings of the system, and you never reach your destination. So obviously, those two extremes, none of those is good. There's a balance there between progress and maintenance for a vehicle. And so a DevOps culture would feel like a reliable vehicle, if you like, with repairs done at the appropriate times, but journeys also completed, and optimizing either for comprehensive repairs or maintenance, or optimizing for only for progress, isn't going to be effective. There needs to be an appropriate balance, appropriate awareness of the need for doing maintenance and operational activities and respecting that. So obviously that will be a case of respecting the operations team and the kind of skills and approach they have, but also respecting the, if you like, the driver or the person who's taking the journey, which arguably is like the dev team, and realizing that both of those are important in order to deliver software effectively. I thought it was quite useful to have a little diversion and have a look at some topologies or structures of teams, because the way in which you interact with other kinds of teams might depend on the structure of your organization and perhaps what suppliers you use, or what suppliers your organization uses for things like hosting and so on. So, for example, if looking at the picture on the left, the type 1 I call smooth collaboration. If, let's say, your organization runs its own infrastructure and has its own operations team, then you might expect to be looking for a collaboration between the development teams and the operations teams, where you have a kind of direct overlap between those two teams. And so the nature of the collaboration there will be somewhat different. from the kind of collaboration you might have if your organisation is using a cloud provider such as Amazon EC2 or Rackspace Cloud for all this infrastructure. So you wouldn't really be talking to the operations people exactly who are building the infrastructure, but the DevOps activities would occur kind of within the realm of the development teams, but perhaps with some specialists who would be concerned and have experience in operational issues and be able to interact with the dev teams on that basis. So in these two different cases here, you'd expect the size of collaboration and the feeling of what that culture is to be perhaps slightly different. And there are lots of different kinds of models for what the depths of DevOps interaction might be like. The crucial thing, though, is that broadly speaking, the kind of interaction is going to be the same. The specifics might be slightly different in different organisations. If you're interested in more details, there's a blog post online that I put there recently, and there's a slide there too. The important thing for me is understanding the shape of the team structure helps us to understand the kind of collaboration that is appropriate for our own organisation and to understand where the responsibilities lie. So, in practice, what would we expect to see on the ground, if you like? What would DevOps culture actually feel like in practice? So I've put together a few examples. This is not comprehensive, but some examples which are kind of food for thought. This is a great film poster from the 1950s, and it's got the word them. Them is word which should disappear from our vocabulary, them or they or theirs, because identifying a completely separate group as having responsibility for stuff that's gone wrong is definitely part of what you'd expect not to be present in a DevOps culture. So here they are. Perhaps it's the developers in the foreground and it's the ops guys in the background, or vice versa. The point is, if we're seeing a completely separate group of somehow responsible or culpable for problems, that's something we need to fix. We need to move it into talking about specific individuals and going down and working with them directly, or seeing things as a joint problem. So pairing is an activity that's quite familiar to many software developers, but I think perhaps less common for ops people. But there's been plenty of research that it's extremely effective to sit down with somebody else, have one person typing on the keyboard and somebody else watching, but not just watching passively, watching actively for mistakes as they're being typed in. And the combination of these two kind of ways of thinking, one which is about kind of creating or actively doing, and one which is sort of inspecting and evaluating, can help to reduce bugs and problems in software systems far more effectively than pretty much any other approach, including massive amounts of testing. So you'd expect to see developers and operations people pairing on all sorts of problems. For example, making sure that logging is done appropriately for one particular environment, or configuring the monitoring in a particular way. So that's a change in everyday activities, if you like. You'd expect to see people from different teams sitting together to work on problems. In 2013, there isn't really any excuse for everyone not to be using version control. It sort of doesn't matter which version control system you choose, just pick one and make sure that scripts and configuration and so on are in version control. And that's particularly for operations people who perhaps have less, traditionally have used version control systems less. This, using a version control system between development and operations can actually help to kind of force a collaboration there if you're having to work together using the same repository to store and version scripts and so on. So that can be a very useful way of bringing about DevOps activity. And the culture then is that, yes, we'll version control everything, we now share these assets and we work on them together. Another feature of what you'd expect to see in a DevOps culture is that operability ends up being a first-class concern. So rather than treating non-functional requirements as something which are optional, then non-functional requirements, or what I prefer to call operational features, are scheduled alongside end-user features for software development as part of the normal iterative development process. And these then software team, software development team, developers, then take much more of an interest in how the system works than perhaps they've traditionally done in the past. Another aspect you'd expect to see is that developers will be on call for incidents, P1 incidents, and if necessary be woken up at 2 in the morning to help diagnose a problem with the software system. And the reason this ends up being important is that if developers have a sense that their responsibility ends as soon as they've committed to version control repository until their software is in some sort of test environment, that they don't believe they have responsibility for production, then it tends to introduce all sorts of bad behavior. If, on the other hand, the operations team know that developers are going to be working with them during an incident, that's an incredibly powerful way of shaping the culture to improve collaboration. The final feature that you'd expect to see in a DevOps culture is there should be no battles between capital expenditure, CapEx, and operational expenditure, OpEx. Though the CapEx, OpEx battles should be sorted out higher up in the organization. There should be no need for an operations team to get a budget code to work with the development team and vice versa. So that's an aspect of the culture which would need to be addressed higher up in the organization. If you're still having CapEx and OpEx battles, that can be that can really prevent the kind of culture and collaboration between dev and ops, which is going to make for a real DevOps culture. So, in summary, what does the DevOps culture feel like? This is what we've seen. It can feel like a sports team playing to win. They have a multi-part objective to score and to defend, but all members of the team have both objectives, or both parts of the objective in mind all the time. So a band of musicians, they have different specialisms, but they all work together. And perhaps it feels like a reliable vehicle. The repairs are done on time, but the journeys are completed too. DevOps culture can also feel like it's never about them and they, it's about us or we instead. We'd expect to see operations people pairing with developers on writing code, so logging and monitoring, operability in general. Operations people using version control, which is becoming more common, but certainly wasn't in the past. And developers concerning themselves with operability and being on call. And finally then, no kind of project code fights or project conflicts. What's next after this? I've got 4 suggestions of things you can do to explore DevOps culture further. The first one is to buy a copy of The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim, Kevin Baer, George Spafford. This is, initially when I heard about this, I was very, very skeptical, I have to say. I was very skeptical. Anyway, I bought a copy and I read it in just over 24 hours. And I was completely sold. This is a really, really great book, which really gives a feel for what DevOps culture is. It starts off by characterizing a very dysfunctional organization, and by using the vehicle, if you like, of a novel, it actually ends up really strongly suggesting what DevOps culture feels like. And really highly recommend buying a copy of the Phoenix Project. And if you've already read it, then share it with your colleagues. If you've never been to DevOps Days event, then they're all over the world now, as you can see in the list here. It started in Ghent, and now many different cities and so on around the world. DevOpsdays.org, highly recommended, a really great experience, lots of great people, and very well organized. There's also the DevOps Summit events. The next one is in Amsterdam in November this year, and there's also one in Bangalore in India in December. DevOpsSummit.com. And the final one then is the workshop that Dira mentioned earlier that I'm taking part in facilitating. And we're calling this a hands-on workshop for DevOps culture. The next dates are 29th of October, that's next Tuesday, and in London, and Amsterdam on the 15th of November. And you'll find us at experiencedevops.org. And that is it. We've now got some time for questions. There would be one or three other questions in this. So I've got a question here from Helen. And the question is this. And by the way, if you want to ask a question, then you can use the chat feature, the question feature inside the GoToMeeting window, probably on the right-hand side of your screen. So a question here from Helen. One of the customers I'm working with asked me about proportional splits between development and operations teams, i.e. how many staff in each. I've asked this question in my DevOps readiness survey, and I suspected there's a good deal of variation. Do you think approaches need to change in development-heavy environments versus operations-heavy environments, and if so, how? So that's an interesting question, actually. I think it sort of relates to, let me just find the slides that I had before. Bear with me one second. So it relates to some of the kind of topology slides that I showed in the middle. So for example, the slide that's on the screen now, what I call type 4, you might have perhaps a startup, perhaps, with a quite small development team, and perhaps they're using quite a large hosting provider. Perhaps the hosting provider also gives them kind of a team of people who can provide experience in operational issues. So perhaps they're providing an effect of DevOps as a service. And so the nature of the interaction there would obviously be feel quite a bit different to the nature of interactions where if you had Dev and Ops teams of perhaps a similar sort of size, or at least if they were co-located within the same organisation. So, Helen, I think you're right that the approach has changed to an extent. The aspects that I've highlighted in this talk today, though, I think will be pretty much fundamental across the board, avoiding the kind of us and them mentality, some basics like making sure you're using version control in the same sort of way, being happy to sit down with other people and work with them together, side by side, from DevOps teams, and avoiding any organisational restrictions or constraints, like budget in particular, which would prevent that. Got a question here from Owen. How would you see DevOps working when you have outsourced a good percentage of your development to a third party and don't want them to have access to production? So that's an interesting question. That would, for example, be applicable to perhaps a large global brand who have engaged a digital agency to do some work for them, but they don't want that digital agency to have access to production. So that does get slightly more awkward in those kind of situations, and perhaps in situations like that, you perhaps need to have a kind of proxy for the operations team. So, for example, on the screen here, there's type 3. Although the infrastructure as a service labeling is not applicable in this case, because your ops team is perhaps inaccessible. Perhaps you don't actually have any access to talk to them even. Perhaps they're in a different country. One option is to have a kind of proxy team that's in green here, who act as a proxy for the operations team and allow the development teams to interact with them as if they were the ops team. So acting as a kind of bridge between the two would be one approach. I have a question here from Sridhar. How best can we use DevOps in the current market situations, and how to convince the management to use this useful technique? So how to convince management. One of the ways you might to convince management is buying this book, Phoenix Project. I've certainly seen some eyes open for people in organisations that I've had contact with, and I've recommended this book, and people have come back to me later saying, "Oh, it's really amazing. It really characterises the problems very, very well." So that's one thing I definitely recommend is get some copies of this book and give them to people in management and get them to read it, because I've seen that work. I've seen it work very well. The other approach to convincing management is to characterize it in terms of costs, or in terms of the opportunities for improving value for the business or for the end customer, and particularly look at things like cycle time and lead time. And there's been quite a lot of, there's a guy called Steve Smith. I think if you go to search for Stephen Smith online, he's Agile Steve Smith on Twitter, and he's done some quite specific investigation into cycle time, lead time, and how to represent that back to the business as a way of justifying the kind of changes that DevOps needs to be more effective. Ultimately, the reason why DevOps exists is to make the technology teams more effective at delivery. So talking in terms of being more effective, reducing waste is a good way of approaching it.